All right, today I want to talk a little bit about layers. This is kind of a quick layers primer. As we know, layers allow us to float objects around, move them around, change their stacking order. If there was anything else to stack behind here. So the first thing across here, it's if you have a lot of documents and want to see just certain types of layers, this is where you'd go. You can turn them on and off. I usually like to have it off. Just simply it's confusing for me. And one of the common problems here is, where did my layers go? I can't find them. And it usually has to do with the fact that we have somehow accidentally turned some of those. So we'll turn that off, at least for this demonstration. The second thing we run into with layers is what we call blending modes. Now we see blending modes not just here in layers, but these are the same blending modes that can be seen in when we're using the brush tool and several other tools along the way. So blending modes is something we pay attention to. By default, it's normal, meaning it's going to show up 100% just like you have it. We have dissolve, which I don't use a whole lot. I guess you could use it to add maybe some texture to something, especially if you're stacking multiple layers. This next group all darkens. So darken, multiply, color burn, linear burn, darker color. Those all will darken as we go through them. And when I say darken, how these pixels are affecting the combination of layers underneath it. Below this group is a group that lightens, and we can see that changes. By the way, in the darken modes, multiply is what you'll use most of the time, and screen is what you'll use most of the time when you're lightening things. This group here plays with the contrast, the difference between lights and darks, so it lightens lights and darkens darks. Overlay and soft light are the two you'll use most often, but we do have some different variations that give some different effects. I say effects, it's all based on the math behind and the logarithm used to determine how two layers will interact, two or more layers will interact. These are some weird ones, difference and exclusion, subtract and divide. Sometimes they give us some very interesting effects. I use them rarely. There are a few special occasions where I might, but that's for another course. Mostly you aren't going to use them often. Hue is going to use the hue component, hue, saturation, and brightness of this layer with the saturation and brightness of the or luminosity of the underlying layers. Saturation is going to leave the hue and the luminosity from the underlying layer and apply it just the saturation to this layer. So you'll see over here where I'm highly saturated, it is intensifying the saturation. Over here where I have no saturation, it's not affecting the layer. Color applies both the hue and the saturation from this layer while keeping the luminosity of the underlying layer. And luminosity applies just the luminosity of this layer while keeping the color of the underlying layer. I do some things with luminosity, especially tweaking up an underlying grayscale and then picking up the color underneath is where I tend to use the luminosity. The hue and the color for changing people's eyes, shirts, that kind of stuff. This is where I use those most often. Okay, so that's a little bit about blending modes here. Next, beside blending modes, we have opacity. How opaque is something? How opaque something is exactly opposite of how transparent something is. So if it's 0 opaque, it's 100% transparent, and vice versa. Let's drop on a couple real quick. Effects there. Layer effects, we've touched before the layer effects. So what this next one is, well, let's do the whole, this will lock a layer, meaning you can't move it or paint on it or do anything else to it. This one will prevent it, will allow you to move it, but you can't paint on it. This one will allow you to paint on it, but you can't move it around. And then this one won't allow us to transform it, and this one will lock it so nothing can be done to it. Get rid of that paint line if I would. Okay, next to that is fill. This does not affect the layer effects. It only affects the fill on the layer itself. So you'll notice that as I turn that down, I can still see my layer effects, though they are, everything else, the fill is completely transparent. If I need to, whereby the opacity affects everything, both the fill and the effects. Working our way down, we start to see the layers over here. We can turn their visibility on and off. We can change their stacking order. These are small gradients that were applied to this image, so you can't really see a whole lot going on there at the moment. We'll come back to those a little bit. If we want multiple layers to work together, we can command click and select the layers or on a PC, control click. Now those layers will move, except I have the layer locked. Haha, nice job. Let's lock and unlock. Okay. So what we're seeing, if you notice that little white line in my layer mask there, it's moving both layers together. That was click and command on a Mac, command click, on a PC, control click. If I click and shift click, it grabs the layer and the bottom layer and everything in between, so now all three of them would be moving. Put them back where they belong. If I know that I'm going to be working with them together a lot, I can do that, and I can Command G on a PC, Control G, and group those layers together. And then I can also affect the blending modes, the opacity, the layer effects of the group as a whole, as well as individually. Something like that, I sure do. Let's undo to. You notice that to unlock that layer, I'm just clicking on that. We can also hide the individual layer effects with the eye tool. Okay, so we can group them together and use them as a group. Command C, and that's probably going to end up with a locked layer here in just a second. Yep, let's unlock that. Thank you. Before I try to grab it again and still can't. We can also link those layers, which we usually do more as a temporary measure. I want them to work together for a little while, and then I don't, so we'll link them together. I will tend to group layers or more so than link them, but we can link them. Link layers. You'll notice that just that one was selected. When I click down here, these are still linked, so let's go ahead and unlink the layers. Okay. Working our way down. We know about blending mode options, and we have played with them a little bit already. You'll notice them also up here. Shortcut if you want to copy and paste them onto multiple layers is just hold the Alt or the Option key and drag, and now I can go in and tweak those around a bit if need be. But that's the quickest, easiest way to move them from one layer to the next. There are other methods, but that's how I go about doing that. This next one creates what's called a mask. Excuse me. This next one is what's called a mask. Masks allow us to hide part of a layer. So I'm going to grab a brush tool, and using my D for default and X to swap foreground and background colors, I'm now painting with black. So as I paint with black, I will hide part of a layer. I can also go, the nice thing about hiding a layer is I can go back and unhide it by painting white. I can also drop a little gradient here real quickly. And we'll see that it gradually fades because there are some gray areas. And I'll click on that. There are where it's gray, it's going to partially hide. Where it's black, it's completely hiding. And where it's white, it's not hidden at all. Holding the Alt Option key again there. And we will do much more with masking when we get into selections. I'm going to unclick these for a moment. This allows them to operate independently. Just make sure you pay attention to which one is actually selected, your mask or your layer. And to get rid of them, I'm just going to throw them away, and I'm going to delete it. Applying this would make this change here permanent. Actually, let me show you. Apply. Now I actually have a transparency as part of that layer. Command Z to undo, and this time I'm going to trash it and delete it, and it's gone. These are adjustment layers. They affect everything below it. These all tend to be more solid in nature, and I have touched on these in class. These will affect the dynamic range. These are used to affect the color mostly, and then we have some specialties there. And so real quickly, just on adjustment masks, turn that one off. So solid color. Hey, guess what? It does a solid color. Then we can change blending modes to make it look something different. Okay. Gradients, and again, we've played with these. You can go grab the gradients, change them, change how they're applied. And I use these for when I need a soft spotlight somewhere. I usually have a black to white or a black to transparent gradient. I can reverse it. Now I have a little spotlight when I kick this into soft light mode. And usually that's probably too strong, but okay. I'm not sure you can see it otherwise, so as I open this back up, I can move that back around and I have a spotlight. It is not uncommon for me to have 3 or 4 or 5 little bitty gradients backed way on back down to 5 or 10% throughout a document, just to kind of bring a little attention where I want that attention, direct the viewer's eye, that kind of stuff. Patterns we've played with a little bit, and again I can change those into any number of of blending modes. Levels and curves are the most two important things here. Levels, we can change the white point. Anything to the right of this becomes pure white. Anything to the left becomes pure black. And then I can adjust my midtones separately. I can also do that on a color by color basis. So if I wanted to do something, for instance, to the blues, I can make the whole image more blue, or taking blue away, the opposite is yellow, so I can cool that whole image down. So if I want it cooler or warmer, I think I said that backwards a minute ago. Cooler means to has too much blue in it. Warmer, a little bit of yellow. So if we want it to feel like late afternoon sunset, that sun's going to be casting a little bit of a yellowish color to it. And so I tend to do that in my levels. The other adjustment layer that is here is curves. Curves should always be moving up to down. They'll give us a lot to work with. They allow us to control exactly what the values are at any given time. What you're really looking for mostly is the change in slope as we move across here. The steeper the slope, the more contrast there is at a given area. So I've got really extreme midtone contrast, and I've really flattened out the contrast here in my darks and my lights, versus I've now flattened out the contrast in my midtones and have a lot more contrast in my lights and darks. And one of the things about curves is I can go all sorts of ways with them. It takes a little getting used to, but they do give us a lot of control. I use them a lot for color correction and enhancing the contrast between different color sets. And like the levels, I can apply it to just this particular channel, reds, greens, or blues. Get rid of a point, you just pull it off. One thing you want to be careful of is if you start doing crazy things, you start getting some really weird results. That's not what curves are usually used for unless we're working for some sort of special effect. Okay, throw those away. We don't need them right now. All right, moving forward. Let's, before we do vibrance, saturation, hue, we can adjust the overall hue of an image. We can increase the saturation or decrease the saturation. Since I usually work through my dynamic range first, I usually don't have much to do with the lightening and darkening here. I can colorize, which I could also do by going to my solid color and just switching it over to color mode. But we can colorize, or we can work on just particular channels. I want to tweak, maybe say the blues, increase the saturation in just the blues, or decrease the saturation in the blues. And so I can go in and work on my three channels, reds, greens, and blues, or my midtones, which are my secondary colors, yellows, cyans, and magentas. If you're whitening teeth, you don't want to knock all the color out, so you want to only desaturate the yellows, by the way. If you try to desaturate it all, everything, you're going to end up with some ultra bright, bony looking teeth. So color balance allows us to control both the shadows, the highlights, and the midtones. For color cast, which you'll notice I've had similar effects elsewhere. Now the thing to understand is, even though midtones will give you the most drastic change right from the beginning, there is a crossover from your shadows and highlights into your midtones. So I always make any adjustments to midtones last. So that'll be my final adjustment in that color balance. This one's been adjusted so much, there's not a lot that I kind of like that. Okay, color balance. Okay, that works. All right, black and white. There's where I mentioned a minute ago, I use luminosity light a lot. I want to really tweak how bright or dark different things are in my image and really get my underlying grayscale right, which is one of the tricks of making images work together. It's getting that contrast and that underlying grayscale just right. I will go tweak that up a little bit to get a nice, and then I will come and kick it into luminosity mode. Back that down just a little for this image. Okay, so that is one place that I mentioned I use luminosity mode a fair amount when I really want to go control exactly what is, how bright or dark certain colors are. Throwing on a black and white color filter is great for doing that. Photo filter helps us neutralize colors as if we were putting a filter on top of our lens, and there's a lot of pre-built ones that either warm the whole image or cool the whole image or give us some really weird special effects, as well as I will actually, since I know complementary colors in an RGB environment can produce a neutral tone, I will from time to time go and click on a particular color that needs to be neutralized. That one doesn't. That one is nice and pure white. Yeah, I'm trying to find. I'll hold the control key, Greg. Yeah, so I've got a little bit of blue cast, which makes sense. I should, but if I wanted to neutralize that, minus 180 would be 39. And so I could neutralize that little bit of blue cast that I had up there by going and making this a complement of that. Okay, that's photo filter. Channel mixer, we'll cover channels another day, as well as color lookup. Invert simply flips everything to its opposite. Posterize gives us some nice cool effects, and we can change how much posterization we have. Again, limited use. Posterize about 20 versions ago was like a really cool overused filter. It has its purposes, but they aren't that much. Threshold forces everything to black or white. Where I will use this sometimes is when I want to really identify the lightest and darkest parts of my image. I will come over here under the color sampler. Eyedropper tool is the color sampler tool. So I can see this is the lightest part of my image. At this point, after all my adjustments, that's the darkest point in my image, so that if I want to come back, throw that away, and do some auto type stuff, I can jump into levels or curves. My black point, my darkest point of the image, should be there, and my lightest point of my image I know is there, and so I can at least get a good start on my levels adjustment or my curves adjustment. By the way, the only time we use the gray sampler is when we know something should be absolutely neutral, as it will cast things in all sorts of various ways if you do that wrong. And so a lot of times in photography, I will actually take a gray card. That's right, just a piece of gray plastic, non-reflective plastic, and hold it up before I do a shoot. in order to know exactly what neutral is. As I scroll back over that, hold the Alt key, and I can cut those little points back out. Option or Alt key. Okay. Gradient map's a funky little guy. It takes our colors. I'll do something here in the purples for the moment. It's mapping. That's really ugly. In this case, the whites are pink, the blacks are purple, and the grays are mapped in between. You can get some really cool effects. There are some gradients that I make that really enhance the sunrises and sunsets, especially if I toss them down into maybe a color mode and back it way down. Or one of my overlays or soft light modes, I can get some nice exaggeration of color there as well. So you can get some pretty cool effects with that. You aren't going to use it a lot of times without changing the blending effect or the blending mode and the opacity. Okay, continuing on, we were to file place, and I'm going to place a linked object here. So let's go grab something. You'll notice that I get this funky little smart object thumbnail. What the heck is a smart object, and why would we use one? A smart object links that layer to another file and or document. I didn't use them a lot. I still don't use them a lot. But as opposed to applying an effect directly, a filter or effect directly onto a layer, if we make it a smart object, we can then go in and do things like add some filters. Let's just blow that guy up. And then later come back and change that. So it's kind of like, it allows us to kind of do like an adjustment later would do, going back and changing the value later if we need to, or getting rid of a filter or such completely if we want to further on down the line. So even though it looks like this image is part of that document, it is a link, which also means I don't want to change file names of whatever I'm linking out to, or change directory structures, because then we're going to break the links. So, which is probably one reason I've never adapted well to smart layers, is I'm off times. I'm not great with being consistent in my file management. If you're excellent with file management and naming and your subfolders and all that kind of stuff, you'll probably enjoy smart objects. If you don't, well, you'll probably be like me and somebody who does not use them often. Let's do one more type of smart object here. This is type. Cool, we have some type. Type is actually a vector object as our shape layers, which means that if we try to add certain, and I'm going to do this, it's going to tell us we need to rasterize that layer. Rasterize means turn our vector shapes, which are mathematically defined, into pixel-based images. So once I do this, rasterize this layer, it's just a bunch of pixels that looks like type, which means I can apply all sorts of filters and erasers and that kind of stuff to it, but I can't go back and edit that type. So instead we can convert to a smart object. And again, in order to edit that, I have to double click it to go to the linked PSB file to edit it. I cannot edit it directly here in this as a smart object, but it does keep this image outside of the actual image so that I can go in and edit it. But at the moment, I can go in and let's grab like a smudge tool. Not going to let me smudge it. Okay. Oh, it's not rasterized. Can't do that one either. But I can go in and add all sorts of Photoshop effects to it. And be able to go back and change it as I go along. Okay? So that would be a smart layer. They are, for the last 2 or 3 versions, they've really been trying to do a lot with smart layers. I like the concept. Like I said, I just don't do a fantastic job with file management, and so I will tend to not use smart layers as often as I will other types of layers. That's most of the layer basics, I think. Let me just glance real quickly, see if there's something else. Clipping masks, okay. So we can also create what's called a clipping mask. Let me go group all of this together for the moment. Grab this and make it a little bit bigger so we can see what's going on. Create clipping mask. Really, you're not going to let me clip the whole group at once? Of course not. And there's 1,000 ways to do things, and you can sometimes there's other ways to do this. I want this clipped into there. Okay, there's a way to do it, and I've never been good about getting this to line up and grab that little line just right for a clipping mask. How I'd really usually do it is I would select that, turn off the type, come over here, and just make a mask. Does the same thing, which gives us a segue into the next subject, which is making selections. And you saw one quick way to make selections is command clicking the thumbnail of a layer. It makes a selection based on the contents of a layer. That one's all selected. You can see the little marching ants tell me we have a selection in place. So we're going to stop there so that we can do a whole different video on all the wonderful ways of selecting objects.